Today I'm going to be speaking about the Battle of Shiloh. My opinion that the Battle of Shiloh was one of the first major battles between both armies, the Confederate and the Union armies, to occur in the West. Of course, there was the Battle of Bull Run in the East. That was a defeat for the Union Army. But in the West, there was the battles of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson that were victories for the Union. Now, to explain how this came about, you have to understand that when the forces of the Union were in Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Ohio River and the Mississippi River, both wanted to have that control of the Mississippi River at that point. Now, in Kentucky, there was a strong defensive position in Columbus, Kentucky, and Hickman, Kentucky, but mostly at Columbus because they had these bluffs that overshadowed the Mississippi River, allowing artillery to be placed to stop any travel going up and down the Mississippi River at that point. Now, when the Confederate forces took Hickman, Kentucky, and Columbus, also taking the bluffs at that point, General Grant countered this offense by taking Paducah, Kentucky. Now, Paducah, Kentucky was important at this point because it was the confluence of the Ohio River and the Tennessee River. And very close by was the confluence of the Cumberland River at Smithland. So whoever took Paducah would also take Smithland, giving them access to those rivers. Now, for the Union Army, taking these rivers was a very important step, and in my opinion, it was the most important step that the Union Army could have done during the war at this point. Taking the Tennessee River and Cumberland Rivers gave the Union access deep into the Confederacy, as I call the gateway into the Confederacy. By doing so, when Grant took Paducah to counter the Confederates taking Hickman and Columbus, he made it abundantly clear that the Union had the ability to transport their troops deep into the South because the Tennessee went through Tennessee, through Alabama, all the way to Georgia, and back up to Tennessee through Chattanooga and beyond. And the Cumberland River gave access straight to Nashville, Tennessee, which was a major hub for the Confederacy for supplies and arms. By doing this move, General Grant was able to take Fort Henry, which was on the Tennessee River, and also Fort Donelson, which was on the Cumberland River, giving him access to and the ability to take Nashville, Tennessee. Now, the next step for Grant and the Army in the West was to go down to and take Corinth, Mississippi. Now, Corinth, Mississippi was a point where the railroads converged from north to south and east to west to the Mississippi, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. By taking Corinth, this was an important step for the Union. To do this, the Union had to transport their troops down the Tennessee and land at a point called Pittsburgh Landing, just south of Savannah, Tennessee. Now, when he landed, he was only able to put his forces in camps and not fortified because he was told by Halleck that he had to wait for General Buell from Louisville that had progressed to Nashville to go from Nashville to Savannah and on to Pittsburgh Landing to combine forces with General Grant. When he did so, that would give them the ability to take Corinth and go from there and proceed with the war. But there was the wait. The question was, what would happen to Grant if he was attacked by a large force of Confederates and a Confederate army under General Sidney Johnston, which that was the plan of the Confederates. They did so. They brought an army up from Corinth and attacked in force, and the Union Army was ill prepared to counter this. Now, this video here shows the Battle of Shiloh, which occurred because at the Battle of Shiloh, there was a small church called Shiloh, and this is a point where Sherman was set up with his camps, and this is the first place, one of the first places attacked by the Confederate forces, and also just east of that where General Prentiss laid his camps. Now, they were south of Pittsburgh Landing. The point of General Johnston's attack was to take this is the Mississippi River right here. He wanted to take the army of the Union and force them away from the Tennessee River to deprive them of their supplies and also reinforcements. Now, as you see, as the battle progresses, this does not happen. At this point, we're going to start the video.
250 Union men of Everett Peabody's brigade are up early on patrol. For the past 3 days, their pickets had been exchanging shots with Confederates. Many worry it signaled a pending attack. But no one in high command had been convinced. That Sunday morning, within earshot of their camps, they find a monster lurking amidst the Tennessee timber. 9,000 Confederates spearheading a surprise attack.
The Union Army thought that these men that the advance scouts were seeing were just skirmishers and of no major problem. Unfortunately, they didn't understand it was the complete army of the Confederates. Even General Sherman thought that it was of no big consequence, and he didn't believe it until the time of the battle occurred.
After the next 2 days at Shiloh, our nation would come to realize the true bloody cost of civil war. By the spring of 1862, the Union's disaster in the East at Bull Run the previous summer seemed a distant memory thanks to a string of victories in the West. In February, the Army and Navy under Union Brigadier General Ulysses Grant and Flag Officer Andrew Foote had worked together to capture Forts Henry and Donelson. Combined with the loss at Mill Springs, Kentucky, General Albert Sidney Johnston, the Western Confederate commander, was forced to move southwest, handing over Kentucky and much of Tennessee, including the crucial supply and industrial center of Nashville. Major General Henry Halleck, commanding the Department of Mississippi, ordered federal forces up the Tennessee River, a major conduit into the heart of the Western Confederacy. The Federals embarked in March, using 174 steamboats to ferry almost 40,000 men toward their eventual target, a now bustling junction in northern Mississippi. In this day, rivers and rails are the key means to move men and supplies quickly, and Corinth, Mississippi is a crucial southern rail link. It straddles the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and sat on the only line connecting the Atlantic and the Mississippi. And by mid-March, Grant's army was in position to capture it as they encamped around Pittsburgh Landing. His was a good defensive position. Waterways protected both flanks and their rear, and they were within 20 miles of Corinth. But Halleck, cautious, has ordered Grant to hold until the 30,000 men of Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio arrives from Nashville. On April 2nd, Johnston learns that Buell's approaching column is near Savannah, Tennessee. It is an opportunity to strike his opponents while they are divided, and Johnston seizes it. General P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter and Bull Run, plans a very complex attack.
You'll notice that General Breckinridge was in the rear of the column. For those that are interested, the 3rd Kentucky Infantry, which was many soldiers out of Paducah, Kentucky, were in that column.
Attempts to coordinate Johnston's 4 corps. But rainy weather turns the roads into mush, delaying the attack. Believing surprise is lost, Beauregard urges retreat. Undeterred, Johnston declares, "Gentlemen, we will attack at daylight." Despite warnings, Union commanders are confident that Johnston's army remains at Corinth. General Grant headquarters across the river at Savannah, and few of the regiments manning what is to become his front lines had ever been in a full-scale battle.
At this point, many of the troops were raw recruits. They'd been training and they'd been training over and over again. Many of them trained in Paducah, Kentucky for the Union. However, they never experienced a battle to full proportions. This being the case, when they were there, they didn't know what to expect. Many of the weapons that you've heard of, like the Springfield 1862, that used the mini ball, which was a conical shaped bullet that was hollow, that when it hit, it would spread out like that, causing major damage, was not in effect. Many of them had flintlock instead of the later weapons that were used by the Union Army. And the flintlock was slower to load, and it also had a ball, just a ball, and some of them had a ball with 2 smaller balls with it, and it spread out like a little shotgun blast. But it was effective, and both of them were using this type of weapon at this time.
Johnston's intent is to turn Grant's left flank away from the lifeline at Pittsburgh Landing. But it's Grant's right that receives the first Confederate attacks as William Hardee's brigades advance on the camps of William Sherman's division. As late as 7 a.m., General Sherman remains unconvinced this is a general attack until rebel skirmishes from Cleburne's brigade kill his orderly and shoot him in the hand.
This is what finally convinced Sherman that the attack was real and that he should be concerned. Before then, he was telling his troops that were saying that there was something going on, that they were being silly and just being afraid of a few skirmishes. Until this point, when he got shot in the hand, he was like, "Oh, this is real. We have to do something." And Sherman did. He set up a line, and he protected as well as he could.
Cleburne's 6 regiments move around the swamp and get caught in a vicious crossfire. The intense fighting here is just south of a church with a Hebrew name that ironically meant place of peace, Shiloh. Despite initial resistance, the Union's lines are soon stretched thin. Benjamin Prentiss forms his 6th Division, including 12 guns on the eastern current.
Little interest about General Prentiss. He was in charge of Cairo before General Grant took over. And when General Grant was given command of that area, General Prentiss went to resign his commission and went back to Cape Girardeau because he was so offended that Grant was given the post instead of him. And when Grant showed up, he wasn't even in uniform, and because he hadn't had the time to get one yet. And Prentice was just totally offended and went back and said, I'm not going to do this. But in this battle, you'll notice that Prentice becomes one of the major players.
His untested ranks wither Gladden's brigade. But around 8:45, Confederate attacks force Prentice to fall back. Many don't stop until they get to Pittsburgh Landing, leaving empty camps, hot meals, and all their belongings. Hungry rebels pause to eat and loot. An hour is lost as commanders, including Johnston, struggle to get these men moving again. Amidst the panic, Union defensive lines are patched together with anyone in shouting distance. And casualties and terrain unravel Confederate command structure. By mid-morning, the battle at Shiloh has become a soldier's fight.
Another interesting point was that many of those that fled went back to Pittsburgh Landing and huddled under the bluffs, trying to escape on the river. Some drowned trying to swim across. Some tried to get on the incoming steamboats that were transporting anybody possible. And there was just a huddled mass of men crying out saying, it's all lost. We can't win this battle. Don't fight. Don't fight. And there were some Union generals that wanted to shoot them for their cowardice. But at this point, there were thousands at Pittsburgh Landing that wouldn't fight, that left the Union in pretty bad shape.
Alerted by the distant thunder of artillery, Grant departs for Pittsburgh Landing around 7:30.
Grant was in Savannah at the time.
He orders Bull Nelson's division of Buell's army to begin moving down the river, but Nelson is unable to march until early afternoon. Grant also orders Lew Wallace's 7,500-man division to reinforce his lines.
Just a little point about Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace was the author of Ben-Hur. They made a movie about it. It's famous. But in this battle, he didn't make it in time. His army kept trying to get from a point north at Crump's Landing to get to them, but they got sidetracked by going down the wrong road and then had to backtrack and go down another road, and they didn't arrive to the battle until the end of the day, which really affected Lew Wallace's reputation as a general.
But a series of errors and delays turn a 2-hour march into 7. Neither will arrive before nightfall. Despite a sprained ankle after arriving at the landing, Grant rides the length of his battle line and rushes men and ammunition to his defenders. But until Wallace and the elements of Buell's army arrive, Grant will fight outnumbered. By 10:30 a.m., the Confederate onslaught starts to overwhelm Grant's right flank. Attacks push Sherman and McClernand back, first to the crossroads of the Purdy and Corinth roads, and then to Jones Field, 1.5 miles from Pittsburgh Landing. Johnston succeeds in bending Grant's line, but in the wrong direction, toward Pittsburgh Landing, where the line can be shorter and stronger. With the Union right flank in retreat, entire Confederate regiments fall out of line to eat and pillage. This lull allows Sherman and McClernand to regroup and launch a ferocious counterattack. By noon, they've rolled over the unprepared looting Confederates. For the next 3 hours, Sherman and McClernand's determined stand will force Johnston to commit his last reserves and will occupy the entire western 2/3 of the Confederate Army.
Remember, the whole point was to get them away from the river, but what they succeeded in doing is push them all back to the river, which, as he said, made the line shorter and also allowed them to congregate the men that they did have that weren't hiding and huddling at Pittsburgh Landing that would fight into a line that could defend.
Confederate brigades on Johnston's right make repeated attempts to dislodge Stephen Hurlbut's division from a blooming peach orchard just south of a pond where the dying crawl for a final drink. By 2 o'clock, Hurlbut's line begins to give after Johnston personally rallies his brigades to attack en masse. Johnston had an old dueling wound that kept his right leg numb most of the time. He may not have paid much mind to the mini ball that severed his artery. By 2:45, Johnston bleeds to death. He is the highest-ranking officer to be killed during the Civil War. In Grant Center, the division of W.H.L. Wallace and the remnants of Prentice's ranks form a half-mile front in a thick overgrowth along an old wagon cut. 6,200 men and 25 cannon make the names of the places there: the Sunken Road, the Hornet's Nest, synonymous with bloodshed. Thousands of Grant's men have retreated in panic. Lew Wallace is missing, and Bull Nelson, Buell's lead element, is an hour out of Savannah. Low on options, Grant orders a new line of defense at the landing. Around 4, Sherman and McClernand, with depleted ranks and no fresh troops, fall back. Confederates pause their attack to get ammunition to the front lines. Sherman and McClernand reform along the heights of a rugged ravine. By 4 p.m., Hurlbut withdraws, forcing Prentice to refuse his left flank.
When they say refuse the left flank, that means they bend it to defend against being outflanked. You can bend either side, and you can even bend all the way to a square. In this case, I had told you earlier that Prentice would play a major part in this battle, and at this time at the Hornet's Nest, he and General William Wallace did hold this area, and when they were surrounded by the Confederates, they bought time for the Union Army to complete their line north of them, enabling the Union to protect themselves.
Grant's right and left flanks in retreat. Sounds of heavy fighting in the center draw Confederate brigades like a magnet. W.H.L. Wallace's outnumbered Federals put up a fierce defense from an overgrown thicket. Their intense fire thickens the air with whizzing metal. Rebels call it the Hornet's Nest. Brigadier General Daniel Ruggles pounds the Hornet's Nest with almost 60 cannon, the largest concentration of artillery on the North American continent up to that time. By 5 p.m., elements of 14 of the 16 Confederate brigades on the field surround the Hornet's Nest. Wallace and Prentice start to withdraw. Then Wallace is shot in the head and left for dead. Over 2,000 men are captured. The day-long federal stand waged all across the battlefield at such places as the Peach Orchard, Hornet's Nest, and Crossroads staves off total defeat and buys Grant another day to fight.
Grant's reply was, "Well, we'll lick 'em in the morning."
Grant's army has fallen back 2 miles and incurred immense casualties. Heavy cannon fire from the Union timberclads Tyler and Lexington pesters the Confederate lines. Grant's last line on April 6th is formidable. Confederates must cross huge ravines at Dill and Tillman Branch. Stalled.
I've been to this battlefield, and I have to say, it definitely was, the Dill and Tillman branches were definitely big ravines. I mean, they would have had to crawl up to get to the other side. And imagine being attacked from the right with cannonballs from the river and also cannons from the line that Grant had formed at Pittsburgh Landing.
To the captured Union camps, little effort is made to supply ammunition or reform their exhausted ranks. That night, a heavy rain moves in, soaking the living and the dead alike. Beauregard.
This rain that came in was heavy, heavy thunderstorms. If you're from the South, you'll understand how bad these thunderstorms can be. And it was a very bad storm that hit that night. And Grant at the time he had the sprained ankle. He was trying to find a place to get comfortable. He went back to headquarters, and because of the crying of the hospitals that were right nearby, he couldn't stand it anymore. So he went and leaned against a tree outside the area. And this is where Sherman met him, and they had their conversation.
Guard, now in command, believes Grant's reinforcements are not coming and sends a dispatch to Richmond proclaiming complete victory. In fact, the lead divisions of Buell's army had a hand in defending Grant's last line, and Lew Wallace's division finally arrives on the scene about dusk.
And later that evening, General Nathan Bedford Forrest sent out patrols to try to see what was going on with the Union line as it was dark, and discovered these incoming soldiers. And he went back to headquarters at the Shiloh church, and he tried to tell them that they were being reinforced, but no one would listen to him.
Though these reinforcements had been spotted by rebel Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest, no one in Confederate high command took any action. Handed his greatest setback since the war began, Grant vows to whip 'em at daylight. By 6 a.m., Grant has 40,000 at the ready, half of which are battle fresh. The weary Confederates number around 28,000. Despite their exhaustion and disorganization, when Grant's army moves to retake the field and drive the rebels back, Beauregard eventually manages a solid defense. Despite his savage counterattacks, he is forced back 2 hours later to a position along the Hamburg-Purdy Road. Ultimately, the Union numbers are too great for Beauregard's depleted ranks. At 2, he pulls back in retreat to Corinth. Grant does not pursue until the next day. Almost 24,000 men are killed, missing, or maimed in just 2 days. Shiloh is the bloodiest battle in American history up to that time. Despite winning Shiloh, Grant is vilified for the shocking losses and near defeat. Many demand his removal from command.
Many also said he was drinking, and at the same time, they went to Abraham Lincoln to tell him to remove him because he was drinking, and Abraham Lincoln said, let me know what he's drinking. And they said, why? He goes, because I want to give it to every general, so they will fight just like he does.
President Lincoln refuses, saying, I can't spare this man. He fights. In Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederacy loses a prized leader. No general will fill his void in the Western theater. Beginning in May with Corinth, the Union Army embarks on a Western mission of conquest, with many more places to fall. Vicksburg, Chattanooga, Atlanta. The battlefield is quiet now, though a new fight is ongoing against the foes of time and progress. Nearly 4,000 acres of land have been preserved, most recently the site of the Fallen Timbers action.
You ever have a chance to visit down in that area south of Savannah, Tennessee, it's well worth your visit to visit the Shiloh battlefield site.
Once host to two of the bloodiest days in American history, Shiloh is now one of the best preserved battlefields of the Civil War, a sprawling living monument to the sacrifices made there 150 years ago.
Thank you for watching this video on the Battle of Shiloh. I hope to have further videos coming in the future, and I appreciate you listening. Have a good one.